Hi everyone, I'm going to be reviewing with you the study guide for your upcoming test. Please excuse my makeshift tripod here. I left my tripod at school, so I needed to have something to show you. So I'm going to go over the study guide with you. Even if you have trouble seeing what I'm doing, you can still listen along and fill out your study guide and use this to study for the upcoming test. So I'm going to start with our elements of art. If you did not already, you can find all the information that you're looking for in Google Classroom. A lot of these questions are coming from the presentation that you reviewed at the beginning of the semester. You also took notes on this presentation when you were in class with Miss Martin. It's the same exact presentation. If you still have those notes, those will help you a lot with filling this out. If you don't though, the presentation is still available. You also want to make sure that you're using the definitions for ceramics PDF that's in Google Classroom, as well as the video demonstrations for filling out the second portion of the study guide. You will not be able to use your notes on the test, so you will want to make sure that you fill this out completely, making sure that your answers are correct so that when you study the correct information. So we're going to start first with our elements of art. We went over our elements of art when we were creating our handbook, reviewing the elements and principles on the handout, and then when you created your design for your cube. So there are 7 elements of art. An easy way to remember this is to think of the elements when you're drawing a picture. So I'm going to list them here, starting with line, and then line creates shape. Texture can be used to create value. Value is used to create form. Form is used to create space. And then we have our very last one. Once you're done creating your picture, you can color your picture. So here's a little helpful hint. Instead of just listing them, I always find that finding a way to remember the steps helps you when you get to the test. So if I have a line, I'm going to start by drawing, a diagonal line. And I'm going to make another diagonal line. Then I'm going to use a curved line to create a shape. I'm going to put a line right here. And I'm also going to make a circle. So this is just an easy little step. You don't have to do this, but it could be helpful for you remembering your elements of art if you follow these steps. So right now I have a line and 2 shapes in front of those lines. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use texture to create value to turn my shapes into a form. And as you can see, I have space in between my shapes, and then I could get some colored pencils and I can color this. So if I know that my light is going to hit in this direction, so here's my light source, I'm going to use some texture here, some cross-hatching. And I'm going to follow along the curved line here. And what I know about value is that it is the light and dark. And we have what's called a value scale that helps us create the 5 values. And I know that from 2-dimensional art, the darker side, the side opposite my light source, will always be darker. So right now I'm using like a hatching to create value here. then I can add my shadow. Using hatching as well. And again, I'm just following the shape. Now remember, I started with lines to create my shapes, and then I used texture to create value to turn my shapes into forms. Now, I want to talk about the space in between both of these soon-to-be forms. Anything that's closer to me is going to appear bigger. Anything that's farther away from me is going to appear smaller. Anything that takes up space is considered positive space. Anything in between, empty, negative space. So now I can do the same thing here, and I'm going to turn my circle into a sphere. And if I really wanted to, I could have colored this and used texture, like a colored texture, to create my sphere. But now I've used all the elements of art to create a tiny picture right here. I started with line. Line creates my shapes. My shapes, using texture and value, turn into forms that show space in between both of those. Those are your 7 elements of art. So now, what is line? Think about that for a second based on what you have already learned from this demonstration and from your previous demonstrations. What do we know about line? Line is a continuous mark made on some surface by a moving point. So if I take my pencil and I make a dot, and then I move that dot, I now have line. Now it says some surface because depending on what type of artist you are, you may use paper and pencil, you may use paintbrush and canvas. Oops, moving. So it's a continuous mark made on some surface. So now in the chart below, we can look at the different types of lines. So there are all different types of lines. I have wavy lines. Some people call them curly lines. I can use vertical lines. I can use a broken line. A thick or bold line. I can use a zigzag line. Some of you guys have already used this type of line on your designs. And I can also use a curved line. I used a curved line to begin with to create the bottom portion of my shape. So all these different types of lines create different types of shapes. Next, we're going to talk about the element of value. So, value refers to the light and dark of a form. Sometimes it creates contrast. If you have a light and dark, or really light and really dark next to each other, you can create this using pencil pressure. So for example, if you are one of those people who has a really heavy hand when you write, your pencil pressure makes your lines and your words probably darker on the paper than somebody who has a lighter pencil pressure. In the boxes below, I know that there are 5 values for our value scale. This is our lightest, and this is our darkest. So some of you like to start your value scales here. I like to start light and then build up. I find it's easier that way. And I have to use a wood pencil for this. And I just lightly fill in my squares. And each time I make a pass over one of my squares, I like to darken them a little bit. Now I'm doing this kind of messy, but that's okay, I can go back and clean it up as I slowly start to build my value. And there I have my value scale. These are my mid-tones right here, or middle grays. It depends on what you like to call them. I call them mid-tones because they're directly in the middle of my lightest and darkest shades. So I can go back and clean that up. And there's my value scale. So we talked about this a little bit. And when you've moved from 2-dimensional art to 3-dimensional art, you will move from shape to form. So an easy way to think of this is that shape is what you did last semester. Everything was on a flat piece of paper. Form is what you're doing this semester, and it's everything that stands up. You build this. So shapes are flat, keyword there. Enclosed areas that have another keyword, 2 dimensions. Length and width. Shapes. There are 2 types of shapes. These shapes right here are geometric. This shape right here is organic. These shapes have defined sides, like this one has an angle, sharp edges. Organics are free-flowing with no defined precise edges. So you'll definitely have to know your 2 types of shapes for what is shape. Next we have form. Forms are objects with 3 dimensions. So anything that you build. This is length, width, and height. This would be like your sphere. This is a 3-dimensional form. These are 2-dimensional forms. So, what element did I use to create this form right here? Think about what else I used to create it. I can use texture, but texture was created using value. So, value is used to turn 2D shapes into 3D forms. Oops. So just by adding value, they go from this to this right here. So, what is the difference between shape and form? This chart is located in your presentation in Google Classroom. You might have this chart as well in the notes that you took at the beginning of the year. So, shapes are 2-dimensional. Form is 3-dimensional. Shapes are flat with no volume. Whoops. Yikes. And volume is anything that takes up space. So that's an easy way that you can think of that. Not like turning up the volume on your music. This is anything that takes up space. So if I have this pencil in my hand right here, this takes up space, it has volume, it's a 3-dimensional form. If I was to draw a picture of this, it would be a 2-dimensional form. Shapes do not have value. And forms do. When you draw a shape, it does not require blending. So you will not be blending to create a shape. However, you will use blending of values to create a form. So this is the chart that you want to think of when you think of the difference between two-dimensional forms and two-dimensional shapes and three-dimensional forms. You can also think of this as what you did last semester compared to what you're doing this semester. Everything was flat last semester. Your drawings, paintings, anything like that is considered a two-dimensional art, while three-dimensional forms are anything that are built up sculpturally. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be clay. People make sculptures out of paper as well, and all different types of found objects. So anything that you can walk around is a three-dimensional form. Anything that's flat on a piece of paper is a two-dimensional form. Two-dimensional shape. So you can fill that out here, and then you can add a little example if you'd like, or you can fill it out on the paper like I just did. But I'm going to now draw an example. I'm going to include a couple, kind of like what I did before. I have my geometric shapes and my organic shapes. And now I'm going to create some forms. If you struggle with making three-dimensional forms, you can follow the steps that I'm doing right here. I like to start with a base gray, so one of your midtones, and then I slowly start to build up on those. And all I'm doing is just layering on top of that. On your test, you will be required to draw an example of a shape and a form. So, if you need to rewind this portion of the demonstration and follow along with how I'm doing this, you are more than welcome to do that. But all it really is just lightly blending your values together. If you find that drawing a sphere is a little bit too challenging for you, you might want to stick with the square or the cube as your example. Simply because it has more precise edges, some find it easier to draw. And these were drawn a little bit messy, but this is just to kind of give you an example. And I could probably clean that up a little bit, but shape, form. All right. Now moving on to balance and also pattern and rhythm. We talked about these a little bit when we were discussing our cube. So balance is a principle of design. There are 3 different types of balance. There is, I'm going to write this over here on this side, radial, which is anything that kind of moves in a circle like this. There is symmetrical. It's completely balanced. So if I had a scale, asymmetrical balance, which means that now my scale is going to be tilted. I'm giving more weight and more attention to one side than the other. So, a type of balance in which both sides of a composition are balanced yet different would be symmetrical balance. They're even. You can make them different, you can make them the same, as long as they both have the same weight. Wait a second. Scratch that. Asymmetrical balance. So now, if I go like this, if this was my drawing right here, this side has more attention than this one. There's more going on this side than there is over here. Asymmetrical balance. So, symmetrical balance is anything that's even. If I drew a line directly down the center of this, they're going to be even on both sides. If I drew a line down the center of this, there's going to be more weight on this side than there is over here. To remember asymmetrical balance, you can think of it like this. One side of the image is going to look heavier than the other. Radial moves only in a circle. So, here's another example, a better example. If this is another one of my pictures, if I have all these hearts over here, and one sad little heart over here, all of these hearts are going to have more weight on the picture than this. This is asymmetrical balance. So, another word for center of interest. We've talked about this a little bit, creating emphasis on your handle. So, emphasis is anywhere that your eye goes directly. So you can think of it as if it caught your attention first, it's the emphasis or the center of interest. It can also be called a focal point because your eye goes there first. Or it focuses there. Also, this is known as dominance because it usually has more power in the image than anything else. So, on your Elements of Art handout and your Principles of Design handout, you may remember that I created an example of emphasis by drawing a flower, and I colored that flower like a really pretty pink, and I created a gray background. The flower is what catches your attention first because it's the main focus point of my drawing. So that becomes the area of emphasis or the center of interest. All of these are the same as this. Now, formal balance. This is what I was thinking of when I messed up right here. Formal balance is symmetrical balance. So, if it's even on a scale, it is symmetrical. This is the same as formal balance. So, a type of balance in which both sides of a composition are balanced yet different, different being the key word, it's asymmetrical balance. Emphasis is anything that catches your attention first, becomes the focal point or the dominance in the image, the center of interest, and formal balance is symmetrical, even on both sides, evenly weighted. Now, building your cube. The first step that we did when we first received our clay was wedging clay. So you're going to explain in detail how you wedge clay. So you're going to get your clay first, and the first thing you're going to do is you're going to place your hands together on the clay. Remember, like this, if my hands were wrapped around the clay. I'm going to push the clay forward, but not slide the clay forward. I'm going to lightly push the clay forward, roll it back, and then rock the clay forward again. I will repeat this step, very important, 10 to 30 times, and I will turn my clay, 3 to 4 times. So remember, I was taking my hands and I was rocking my clay forward, rolling it back, pushing it forward again, rolling it back, pushing it forward again, and then I would bring my clay together, turn it, repeat the same steps, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for a total of 10, and then I would turn it again. So it's almost like you're working out a little bit. 10 reps, right? Except you're doing this with clay. You want to make sure that you're completing that step so that there are no air pockets and that your clay is combined and ready to work with. Now, what are the 5 stages for building our cube? Number 1, I'm going to throw a slab. To cut tiles. 6 of them. I'm going to connect my sides. I'm going to bring all sides together. I'm going to add the sides to the base. And add my design. These were the 5 stages that we went through to build your cube. So remember, we threw the slab first to cut the tiles. Then we connected the sides, and we had 2 sides. And then we brought all of our sides together. and then we took our sides and we flipped it onto the base, and then we connected it together using a coil, and then you added the design. So, how do you throw a slab? After you've wedged your clay, you're going to, number one, stand. I like to say place one foot in front of the other. You're going to swing your clay forward or at an angle. And then you're going to make sure that the far end hits the table first, and slides. You're going to turn your slab and repeat. So we took our slab, we took it and swung it forward, then pulled it towards us, or kind of threw it towards us, making sure that the back end hit first and that your clay slid. Then you would grab an opposite end, take your clay and throw it again, turn, throw, turn, throw. Now, what are the steps for attaching two pieces of clay? Now I know some of you did not participate in this activity with me because, of course, it makes you look goofy, but it's an easy way to remember how you attach both pieces of clay. So, if my two hands are two pieces of clay, I have to score each piece, add slip to each piece, lightly score again, attach, and blend. I'm going to score each piece, add slip to each piece, lightly score each piece again, attach both pieces, and lastly, I'm going to blend. I'm going to score, slip, score, attach, and blend. Score, slip, score, attach, and blend. So, next I'm going to think of my examples that I came up with for my cube, and I'm going to draw an example of each. So, remember what you know about pattern. Pattern is lines, shapes, and colors that repeat over and over again. Rhythm is like a moving pattern. So it's lines, shapes, colors that repeat but also create a sense of movement. So, an example of pattern. There's my pattern. I have a square, line, circle, line, square, line, circle, line, square, line, circle, line, square, line, circle, line, square. So I'm using lines and shapes and also a little bit of value to create my pattern. They are shapes and lines that repeat over and over again. Now, for rhythm, this is a little bit different. This right here uses lines, shapes, but it also adds movement because it's like my pattern is moving all along this line right here. So this would be considered rhythm. You have to think of all of these moving all along a line. So you don't necessarily have to have a line in order to create rhythm. You could just leave it as it is. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. Using just these lines, I'm kind of creating the illusion of movement here. Because they don't go in a straight line, they move, kind of along a zigzag. If I add this detail line right here, this also kind of adds to that sense of movement. So remember, pattern is simply lines and shapes that repeat and also color. Rhythm is the same thing except it has to look like it's moving. Our last two questions. So, how do you create 6 even tiles? Well, step 1, you have to throw a slab. Two, you're going to use a ruler and a needle tool to cut the tile from a template. The key words that I'm looking for here are that you're throwing a slab, that you're using a ruler and needle tool to cut from a template. You didn't just freehand cut your tiles, you had to measure them out along the template, or not necessarily measure them, but you had to use a template to make sure that all 6 of your tiles were the same. So this is the key word here. Anytime you want your shapes or designs to be the same, you can always use a template. You used this when you created your designs. Well, some of you did. Let's say you created a star shape like I did in my design. I cut out a star, placed it onto the slab, and used my needle tool to cut all the way around it. So anytime you want to cut a design, a square, a tile, and you want them all to be even, you're going to use a template. So how do you attach the sides of the cube? You're going to explain this in detail. So if I know anything about attaching 2 pieces of clay, you want to make sure that this answer includes this right here. If you are not including this, then you are missing the key points of attaching parts of your tile. So, how do you attach the sides of the cube? Well, I need to first select 2 tiles. I'm going to roll a coil because I want to prep that beforehand. Then I'm going to score the beveled edge of both tiles. Oops. I'm going to add slip to both beveled edges. I'm going to lightly score again. Attach the beveled sides. Blend the seam using a wood tool. Next, I'm going to lightly score the seam. I'm going to lightly score the seam and my coil. Almost forgot that. Add slip to both the seam and the coil. Lightly score again. I'm going to attach the coil to the inside seam of my tiles. Oops, let me back up a little bit. Once I have my coil placed, I need to make sure that I divide my coil in half. And I'm going to blend. So I want to divide my coil in half, and I want to blend half up and half out. So remember, we had our 2 tiles that were like this. I placed my coil on the inside and I blended half this way, outward, and half upward. So out and up. And then finally, I'm going to smooth the inside of my tiles. So, once I have my 2 selected tiles, I'm going to roll a coil. I'm going to score the beveled edge of both tiles. I'm going to add slip to both beveled edges, lightly score both beveled edges again, attach the blended sides, blend the seam using a wood tool, lightly score the seam and coil using a needle tool, add slip to both the seam and the coil, lightly score again to the seam and the coil, attach the coil to the inside seam of the tiles, divide the coil in half, and blend half up and half outward. Using the rib tool, I'm going to smooth the inside of my tiles. And then, finally, I'm going to repeat on additional tiles. The information that I gave you in this demonstration is everything that you need to know for your test. You want to make sure that you fill in any areas that are not correct. You want to make sure that you make adjustments where you need to, and that you study for your test. If you have any questions, please make sure that you ask me. You will have about 10 minutes before the test to review your notes, and you will be submitting your study guide to me for points. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me.